The auctioneer knocked the half-ton bell down at $40, and the loudest man on the lot laughed at him in front of the whole crowd. Silas Rourke did not laugh back. He just lowered his hand, the bid already his, and looked at what he had bought, a great green bell the size of a rain barrel, gone the flat dead green of old bronze left out in the weather. Canted in a rusted iron yoke on rotten timbers where a hoist had set it down years before and never moved it again. To every soul on that lot it read as scrap, half a ton of green metal, a dead man's junk, worth hauling off only because bronze weighed something at the scale. The clapper hung crooked, and still inside it, the iron seized red with rust. And somewhere under the green crust on the crown, where nobody had troubled to look, was the raised lettering of the house that cast it. Silas had just paid $40 to own all of it, the green bell, the rusted yoke, the crooked clapper, and the lettering under the crust. It was a bright, clear morning at a lot sale on the old Vane place at the edge of town. The household goods ranged out on the grass, and off to one side, on the rotten timbers where a chain hoist had lowered it a dozen years before, the green bell that had come down out of the old Zion church. Silas was 73, lean and a little stooped now, but sure in the hands, with a deeply lined face gone soft and weathered, close-cropped white hair under a flat cap, and pale, patient eyes. His hands were broad and scarred and careful, the fingers still steady the way a founder's stay steady when he has spent a life pouring metal and setting bells true. He had come up in the bell trade young, a founder and a bell hanger, one of the last men on that stretch who could cast a bell, tune it on the lathe, and hang it true in a tower, and read a bell by its tap and the lettering on its crown the way another man reads a page. Until the towers went quiet, the old foundries closed, and the churches that did not simply switch on a recording were pulled down and their bells sold off by the pound. The smell of hot bronze and foundry sand never left him. The man who laughed was Del Corbett, who ran the biggest scrap metal yard on that stretch of road, a heavy-set man of about 55 in a loud checked jacket he wore to be seen in, a thick ring on one hand and a roll of bills in the other. $40, Del said, loud, so the whole lot could hear it. $40 for half a ton of green cowbell. It's cracked sure as anything sitting out here this long. And a cracked bell is worth exactly what the bronze weighs. You can't ring it, you can't sell it. All you can do is cut it up and haul it to the scale. That is not a bell anymore, old-timer. That is a green lump of somebody's dead church. He coined the name right there, loud enough to carry the $40 cowbell, and it stuck for the rest of that month. Because a great green weathered bell, canted in a rusty yoke, did look like nothing so much as a piece of junk too heavy to bother with. The crowd laughed because Del laughed, the way a crowd does. Silas stood through it without a change in his face and let the laughter pass, the way weather passes a man who has decided to stand out in it. Now, if you have ever watched a quiet, capable man get talked over by a loud one, if you have ever known somebody whose skill the world leaned on when it needed a hard thing done and forgot the rest of the time, then you already understand what this channel is about, and you might take a second to subscribe, because the people who stay for stories like Silas's are who Iron Hook Stories was built. 4. Silas said nothing. He had learned a long time ago that work does not answer to noise. What Del Corbett could not have known, grinning behind his roll of bills, was that Silas had walked up to the bell at first light, before the sale, with a lifetime of the trade awake in him. The crowd saw a green lump, Silas saw a bell. He had scraped a thumbnail of the soft green crust off the crown and found hard sound bronze under it, unpitted, and the edge of a raised letter cast into the metal. Then he had touched the little hammer he carried to the sound bow. Not a strike, just a tap, and the bell had answered him, low and long and clean, the notes swelling up out of the bronze and hanging in the cold morning air a good while before it died. A cracked bell answers dead, a dull tick, and nothing after. This one rang. And a whole, sound, tuned tower bell, not a lump of scrap, but an instrument, cast and voiced by a real house and hung by real hands, was a thing Silas knew the worth of, because he had watched the trade throw its like into the furnace all his life. When the old churches came down, their bells went to the scrap men to be melted for the metal until a sound. Documented tower bells survived whole almost nowhere. A whole old bell that would still ring true was the one thing the old founders said you would stop seeing. Silas had come up hard. He went into the trade young, carrying sand and tending the cupola before he was trusted near the poor, apprenticed to an old founder who cast church bells and taught him the whole of it. How to build the mold and set the core, how to melt the bell metal and make a clean pour, and last and hardest, how to tune a bell on the lathe, shaving the bronze a hair at a time to bring its notes true, and how to hang it so it swung free and struck right. He and his wife, Adele, had gone where the work was through the good years. Until it dried up, the foundries closed one after another. The towers went to electric hammers and loudspeaker recordings, and the churches that dwindled were pulled down and their bells sold for the weight of the metal. Adele had died after a long illness, and they had raised no family of their own, and after she was gone, he lived alone in the small house beside his shop. The town had a use for his hands and no use at all for his trade. A man who had spent his life giving towns a voice to ring their hours and bury their dead could no more walk past the last real bell in the county going for scrap money than walk past his own life. So he bid, because he had heard under the green crust the one thing that does not belong in a lump of scrap, a bell that still rang true. If you've made it this far into Silas Rourke's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. He let them sell the rest of the estate first, and when the auctioneer finally worked back to the bell and called for a bid, Dell glanced over, called out his joke again, and not one other hand went up. Silas raised one finger, and the gavel came down at $40. He paid cash, signed the slip, and then did the slow, heavy work of moving half a ton of bronze the careful way, a borrowed tractor and a chain hoist and a set of good timbers, and 2 long afternoons the way a man moves a thing that would crack its own skirt if he let it drop, and hauled it home to the open bay of his shop, where there was room to work all the way around it. He set it down easy and stood a while looking at the great green shape of it, taller than a man is wide, and thought about the hands that had cast it and hung it and meant it to ring over that town forever. The story got around before the borrowed tractor was back to its owner. By Monday, people who had not spoken 20 words to him in years stopped him on the street to ask, grinning, whether he meant to hang his cowbell on the porch or leave it out in the pasture for the cows. Merle Sisk, who ran the feed and hardware counter, said it plainer that there was nothing out there but a dead church's green junk, that a bell that old was cracked for certain and cracked bronze was worth only the scale, and that an old man with no tower left to hang a bell in had no business spending his winter on half a ton of it. Silas was buying soft rag and rotten stone, fine bronze wool and lamp oil, and a can of penetrating oil for the seized iron, and did not look up. "We'll see," he said, and that was the whole of his answer. He had spent a life learning that a bell is either sound or it isn't, and that the noise a crowd makes has nothing to do with which. He set the bell up on timbers in the shop bay and went at it the slow way, alone, through the fall and the first winter, the way a man goes at anything a careful hand once made and time has nearly taken back. He worked the green crust off the bronze a hand's width at a time, with rag and rotten stone and oil and endless patience, bringing a dozen years of weather and a half-century of soot off the metal without cutting a single new scratch, until the bronze came up under his hands the warm gold of a new struck bell. He soaked the seized iron yoke for weeks and worked it free, freed the crooked clapper where it had rusted to its staple, and hung it back true on a new leather so it fell right against the sound bow. He went over every inch of the lip in the sound bow with a glass for the fine dark line of a crack, and found none. And it was the crown he saved for last, and it was the crown that gave the whole thing up. Two things came off that bell that first winter that Silas told nobody about for a while. The first came off the crown. Working the last of the hard green crust from the shoulder one night, his rag came away from raised metal, and he worked the rest bare with oil and his thumb, raised letters cast proud in a band around the crown. Gone dark but whole, a name he had to turn to the lamp to read, Meneely and Co. And below it, West Troy and Y. And a year stamped deep in the bronze. Every founder of his generation knew the name, because it belonged to the greatest of the American bell houses, the West Troy works that cast tower bells for half the steeples of the country. Each one tuned true and signed in the metal with the house and the town and the year it was poured. And around the waist, in a second band he cleaned out letter by letter, was cast the dedication it had been founded with, the name of the Zion congregation, a single line of scripture, and the year the bell was hung. The second thing was down in the rusted yoke, wrapped in oilcloth and wire where a stranger would never have looked, a small, soft, watermarked book, a sexton's tolling register, every ringing of that bell set down in a careful hand, and folded into the back a note in the same hand that said the church was coming down and the bell was not going to the scrap men while he had breath. Silas sat down slow on a timber with a little book in his hands, because he knew now whose bell this had been. Josiah Vane had been the last sexton of Zion Church, the man who rang that bell over the town for the better part of 40 years. The funerals, the weddings, the hours, every day of his working life. When the congregation dwindled and the church was condemned, the wreckers were going to drop the bell the fast way and sell it to the scrapyard for the bronze, the way it had gone with the bells of 100 pulled-down churches. Josiah could not stand it. He asked to take the bell down himself rather than see it dropped and cut up, and they let him. Glad of the trouble, he saved them. He rigged the tower and lowered the bell by hand, the last thing he ever did in that steeple, saved the yoke and the clapper, wrapped his register in the iron, and hauled the whole of it home, meaning to see it hung again somewhere the town could hear it, and running out of years instead. The bell sat a dozen years on his timbers being called grain scrap, whole and sound and signed the whole time. Saved by the one man in that town who could not bear to let its voice be melted down. The bell had its own long history, and the town had let it go for scrap money without once asking after it. The Meneely works of West Troy, across the river from Troy, New York, had been one of the great American bell foundries, and for the better part of a century it cast tower bells that rang over towns from one coast to the other. This one had been poured in the 1870s and hung in Zion's Tower that same year, and for generations after it was the voice of the town, until the congregation failed and the church came down. When the old churches were pulled down, their bells were melted for the bronze the way Silas had watched all his life, until a sound documented tower bell survived whole almost nowhere. And the people who kept account of the surviving Manili bells had this one down as sold for scrap and lost. The second winter belonged to the tuning and the hanging, because a bell is not a lump you strike, but an instrument voiced to true, and it comes right only when it swings free and a clapper strikes it clean at the sound bow. Silas checked the old voicing against his own ear and his tuning forks and found the Manili work still true after 100 years. The notes standing where the West Troy turners had set them, he built a new headstock of seasoned oak to carry the weight, banded it in iron he forged himself, and hung the bell so it balanced and swung free. He set the clapper to fall a hair proud of dead center, where it would strike and spring back and let the note ring on. Then he raised the bell on the frame he had built and set it rocking, easy at first, and let the clapper fall. And the bell spoke, the whole shop filling at once with that low, round, swelling note, rolling out the open bay into the winter dark and out over the sleeping town for the first time in a dozen years, hanging on long after the strike the way only a sound bells will. Silas stood beside it with his hand on the warm bronze and did not move for a long while, the way a man stands when he hears a voice he had not heard in 30 years. In the spring he wrote to the State Historical Society up the line, to the soft-spoken man there who had kept the count of the survivors, and a while later the man drove a long way to see it, walked around the hung bell without saying much, and went very still over the crown lettering and the dedication band. Then he told Silas plainly what he had. That foundry mark and that year were in the Manili Works records and the old church papers both. They gave the year the bell was poured at West Troy and the steeple it was cast for, the Tower of Zion Church, whose bell the county history had carried for years as sold for scrap when the church was condemned, presumed cut up, and melted with all the others. This was it. The sole survivor of that church, and, rarest of all, not a cracked relic bolted to a plaque, but a whole bell, tuned true and rehung and ringing. A documented Manili tower bell like this, he said, was worth many times its weight in bronze. A comparable one, restored and complete, had been valued for insurance at $40,000, and this one was whole, and it rang. The $40 cowbell the lot had laughed at held, in the bronze of it, a small fortune, and, worth more than the money, the last true voice of a pulled-down church, saved by a dead man who could not bear to hear it melted. Silas did not sell it. A collector wrote within the month and offered a hard check to take the bell away and stand it mute in a garden of his own where no one would ever ring it. The scrap trade would have cut it up for the bronze without blinking. Silas turned them both down, and a few in the town thought him a fool a second time. He let them. Cutting the old bells up and carting them off out of earshot was the very thing that had killed them. One steeple at a time, Josiah Vane had saved this one against exactly that day, and, as Silas said, a bell was made to be heard. There was no truth in doing to the last one what had been done to all the others. That part was never the point. So he set himself to see the bell hung again, where the whole town could hear it ring, and to find whatever family Josiah Vane had left. Josiah Vane had a daughter living yet, a gray woman named Ruth in a house up the valley, who had grown up in the sexton's cottage under that steeple to the sound of her father's bell crossing the town every hour of her girlhood, and who had signed the estate papers believing the green bell her father always meant to do something with was a scrap lump the auction had been lucky to get $40 for. Silas went to her that spring with photographs of the bell cleaned and hung and shining, the bronze come-up gold, and the dedication legible around the waist. And last of all, he put her father's tolling register in her hands and let her turn it over, soft and worn, in the hands of the daughter of the man who had rung every entry in it. She laid a hand flat on the table and went quiet a long time. They had all thought the bell died with the church. Here was proof her father had spent the last of his strength making sure it would not. She asked Silas why he had troubled himself, an old man, 2 winters, for a stranger's bell. He said only that a bell is a promise handed forward, and that he had nobody of his own to leave a thing to, and had rather leave the town its voice back. They put the bell where the town could hear it, hung whole and swinging again in a little open bell tower they raised for it on the green by the war memorial, where the note could roll out over the roofs the way it had from Zion's steeple for 100 years. Silas hung it himself, true and swinging free, and on the first evening it was to be rung he let it be known that the bell would ring at dark. The town came the way it comes to a thing it is laughed at, early and in numbers, and wearing its doubt where he could see it. Del Corbett parked his truck at the back of the crowd and stood by the tailgate. Ruth Vane stood up front by the frame where Silas had asked her to stand. He caught the rope and set the bell rocking, and when it came up to full swing, he let the clapper fall, and the bell spoke out over the town, that low, round, swelling note rolling out over the roofs and the fields, over and over, the way it had crossed a girl's window a lifetime before, over a town that had not heard that voice in a generation. The crowd stood dead quiet. And then, all at once, not quiet at all. Nobody laughed. Somewhere at the back, a truck pulled out early. They kept the bell ringing where the town could hear it. The people who keep the count of the surviving Manili bells wrote Zion's bell back onto the roll as found and whole and rung, and every year after it rang the hours off the green and tolled slow for the town's dead and rang bright over its weddings. The foundry mark and the dedication polished clean around it, Josiah Vane's tolling register open under glass at the foot of the tower for anybody to read. The people who had called Silas a fool let the name, the $40 cowbell, drop and did not pick it up again. Del Corbett was not run out of business and was not made a villain. He was simply a man who had laughed loud at a thing he never bothered to walk up to, and the next time he held court at a sale, the others did not lean in so far. And on a still evening that next fall, the last light going gold over the town, Silas Rourke, the man who had been 73 years old the day that gavel fell and the whole auction laughed, stood under the great bell after the crowd had thinned, and laid one broad scarred hand flat on the cool bronze over the maker's mark, and nodded once the way a man nods at a job that was done right. The work had set it for him, the way work always did. A bell is a promise handed forward, the house casts its name into the crown, and the last man to ring her takes her down with his own hands and saves her voice and leaves the record in the iron, both trusting that somebody will come along who can read bronze and keep the promise. And a town rarely knows what it let go for scrap until somebody troubles to ring the thing it laughed at. So I'll leave it to you. Was Silas Rourke right to give the bell back to the town to ring for everyone, taking none of the fortune he could have had for it, or should he have taken the collector's check, an old man who could have used the money, and let the last voice of Zion Church go silent behind a garden wall? Tell me which one in the comments, and I'll read them.